It started with the slow, uneven sound of a prosthetic foot hitting the courtroom floor. Thump, tap, thump, tap. Every eye in courtroom 12B turned as Staff Sergeant Lucas Trent, 34, stepped forward. His gait was unsteady, but his presence was thunderous. Wearing a clean button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a pair of slacks that didn't quite hide the high-grade prosthetic below his right knee, Lucas didn't carry himself like a victim. He carried himself like a soldier on a final mission. He wasn't there by choice. He had been dragged into this court under accusations of unlawful conduct and aggressive behavior after an incident at a public housing meeting where he stood up, literally and figuratively, for a group of local veterans being evicted to make room for luxury development. The irony: one of the city attorneys pushing for the development had once shaken his hand at a military fundraiser, and now she was seated at the prosecution table. The judge, the Honourable Gregory Marler, 59, had a reputation for snark. Known for his intolerance toward emotionally driven theatrics, he'd made it clear early on that this would be a facts-only hearing. He looked down over his glasses as Lucas approached the defence podium. "Mr. Trent," he said, voice dry, "I assume you won't be requesting special accommodations to testify." A pause. Lucas stopped in his tracks, steadying himself with the rail. "No, Your Honour," he said calmly, "just standing room and some truth." The judge smirked. "Let the record show that Mr. Trent, despite his condition, has refused assistance. Interesting approach. Maybe pride is stronger than pain." A murmur rose in the gallery. Lucas didn't flinch. But the moment cracked something in the room. The judge's words weren't just dismissive. They bordered on contempt. A reporter in the second row started scribbling furiously. Lucas took a breath. "I didn't come here to be pitied. I came here because the men I served with, men who gave more than I did, are being treated like an inconvenience, and when I spoke up, I was called disruptive. So if we're going to talk about pride, Your Honour, let's at least make sure it's earned." The courtroom went still. Judge Marler's eyes narrowed. "This is a legal proceeding, Mr. Trent, not a recruiting commercial. Stick to the facts." Lucas nodded. "Absolutely. Fact 1, you're mocking a soldier for standing without a leg. Fact 2, that leg was left behind in Ramadi. And fact 3, he stepped closer, you're going to hear every single reason why I'm not the one who should be on trial today." The judge tried to interrupt, but Lucas was just getting started. Lucas Trent didn't raise his voice, he didn't pound the podium or gesture wildly. But his words struck with the precision of a sniper's scope. "Your Honour, I lost my leg in 2011, IED outside Ramadi. I woke up 4 days later with a tube in my throat, my mother crying at the edge of my bed, and a surgeon explaining how I'd need to relearn how to walk, drive, and live." He paused. "I don't wear a uniform anymore. I don't ask for salutes. But I'll be damned if I let someone in a robe or a suit tell me I don't belong in the same room as the people I fought to protect." The gallery murmured. A woman in the back silently placed her hand over her heart. Judge Marler cleared his throat. "Mr. Trent, I suggest you stick to the incident in question. What happened at the community housing meeting?" Lucas nodded. "I stood up." More silence. "That's it," the judge said sarcastically. "You just stood up and chaos ensued?" Lucas took a breath. "Let me give you the full picture." He turned slightly to face the courtroom, not just the judge. There were 14 veterans in that meeting room, most over 60, 2 in wheelchairs, 1 had to be carried in. The city rep stood up and said our housing was being repurposed for urban revitalization. No notice, no offers of assistance, just get out by April, he continued, voice steady. I asked one question, just one. Where exactly do you expect them to go? The judge scoffed slightly. And then? They asked me to leave. I refused. They called security. I remained seated. Then I stood because I wasn't going to sit while they erased people who already gave so much. The prosecutor stood. Objection. He's turning this into a political statement. Lucas turned to her. No, I'm making a moral one. The judge banged the gavel once. Enough! But the courtroom wasn't listening to the judge anymore. They were listening to Lucas. He looked around the room. This city invited me to cut a ribbon on Veterans Day, gave me a plaque, wrote up a feature in the paper, called me a hometown hero. He pulled something from his pocket and held it up. It was that very plaque, cracked, chipped, edges frayed. I brought it with me today, he said, placing it on the table. So the court could see what you left me with after the applause stopped. His voice hardened. You want me to apologize for raising my voice when you silenced my brothers? Fine, but I won't apologize for standing, even if it's only on one leg. A beat, too. The judge didn't move, because everyone in the room knew Lucas hadn't taken the stand. He had taken the ground. The courtroom was still, like the moment just before a storm breaks. Judge Marler tried to reclaim the air. He leaned forward, tapping his gavel again, not with force, but with uncertainty. Mr. Trent, this court is not a forum for dramatic declarations. We're here to determine whether your behavior constituted disorderly conduct. You interrupted a municipal proceeding. You raised your voice. You refused to vacate the building when asked. That is the case, not your biography. Lucas remained calm. No, Your Honor, he said. That is the case, because the reason I didn't sit down is the reason I'm standing here now. He turned to the prosecution. You want to criminalize the moment I stood to speak, but not the system that decided veterans were a burden to the city's real estate portfolio. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and held it up. This is a letter from one of the veterans in that room. Charles Baines, Vietnam vet, 2 Purple Hearts. He passed away 2 weeks ago in a temporary shelter because he had nowhere else to go after you bulldozed his apartment. Gasps. One woman in the gallery covered her mouth. Lucas unfolded the letter, voice heavy now. To whoever finds this, I've seen a lot of people forget. Forget the war, forget the names, forget the ones who didn't come home. But Lucas remembered. He stood when no one else would. He reminded them that even the broken still have value. Don't punish him for that. Thank him. Lucas lowered the letter. His eyes glassed, but his voice stayed firm. You want to prosecute someone? Go ahead. But make sure you also prosecute the people who ignored Charles when he begged for heat. The officials who said the building was too old to maintain, but not too old to flip for condos. The judge shifted, visibly uncomfortable. Mr. Trent, emotional manipulation won't serve you here. Lucas raised his eyebrows. Is that what this is? Manipulation? Or maybe it's just reality finally being spoken in a room where it usually gets shut out. The prosecutor muttered something to her assistant. Lucas didn't flinch. You can take my leg, he said, pointing to his prosthetic. You can take my reputation. But you're not going to take the memory of Charles, or silence the echo of every man who thought he'd come home to a country that kept its promise. And then he looked straight at the judge. And if that leaves you shaking, maybe it's because deep down, you know I'm right. Silence. Not a single person looked at the judge. All eyes were on the man with one leg and the moral ground under both feet. As Lucas sat down, even the sound of his prosthetic leg touching the floor carried weight. The judge scribbled something, avoiding eye contact. The prosecution straightened their files like paper could somehow counter what just happened. Then, from the gallery, a hand slowly rose. The bailiff turned. Identify yourself, he said. The man stood, mid-60s. Grey hair, wearing a dark blue VFW jacket, on his lapel a small gold pin shaped like a folded flag. My name is Captain Vernon Clay, U.S. Army, retired. I'd like to speak. The judge frowned. You are not on the witness list, Captain. No, Clay replied, because no one ever thinks to ask us until the damage is already done. Marler hesitated, but the gallery was silent, listening. Clay stepped forward. I was in that room the day Lucas Trent spoke up. I was 2 chairs down. I watched him stand. And I watched a city official ask him if his military mindset made him incapable of understanding how cities evolve. He looked directly at the judge. Lucas didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply said, I didn't lose a leg for you to lose your memory. Clay continued, his voice gathering power. You think this is about disruption, but the real disruption was what they did to us, to our homes, our dignity, our peace. He pulled a photo from his pocket, held it up. This is our unit in Fallujah. 2 of these men are buried. 1 is missing. Lucas saved the 4th, and now he's being dragged into court because he did what we trained him to do. Stand when it's easier to sit. Speak when silence is safer. Defend the ones who can't. Judge Marler tried to interrupt. Captain, but Clay wasn't finished. You called him dramatic. You mocked his leg. But let me ask you something, Your Honor. He took a step forward. When did a city become so afraid of courage it had to handcuff it? Gasps. The judge froze. Captain Clay turned toward the gallery. This man is not the problem, he's the mirror, and that's what's really making you uncomfortable. Then he turned back to Lucas. You stood for us, brother. Now we stand for you. One by one, veterans in the gallery stood up. No shouting, no chanting, just presence. And in that moment the courtroom transformed. Not into chaos, but into clarity. The veterans stood in silence, some with canes, one with a walker, one with nothing but a determined stare and a worn camouflage cap in hand. Judge Marler didn't speak. He couldn't. His gavel rested untouched. For once, the bench didn't feel like power. It felt like exposure. Lucas Trent remained seated, his eyes fixed on the floor. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't basking in validation. This wasn't about being right. It was about being heard. The prosecutor rose again, attempting to regain order. Your Honor, I must object to this emotional theatre. The state's position remains that Mr. Trent's actions at the community hearing were inappropriate, disruptive, and in violation of Municipal Code 719. A voice interrupted her, but not from the bench, from the back of the courtroom. Soft, feminine, unsteady. May I speak? A woman stepped forward. Late 40s. Simple dress, hands trembling slightly as she clutched a folded newspaper. I'm Renee Baines. My husband was Charles Baines, the man Lucas mentioned earlier. The judge hesitated. Mrs. Baines, this is highly irregular. I know, she said gently, but so was being told that my husband of 31 years had frozen to death in a city that once gave him a parade. Gasps again. Reporters scribbled furiously. She unfolded the newspaper in her hands. A front-page story from 5 years ago. Vietnam vet honored at City Hall. There was Charles, shaking hands with the mayor, smiling, proud. And then they moved him out to make room for loft apartments, Renee continued. No relocation assistance, no help, just a notice. Her voice broke. Lucas came by every week, with groceries, with medicine, with his own check, even though I knew he didn't have enough himself. She turned to the judge. You called him too emotional. I call him loyal. Then she walked to the witness stand and placed the newspaper beside the cracked plaque Lucas had brought earlier. Both of these are worthless now, she said, but both were once promises. The judge leaned back, visibly shaken now. Mrs. Baines, You don't need to say anything, she replied. Just see something. She nodded toward Lucas. Because for the first time in a long time, someone saw us. The room fell still again. Even the bailiff looked down. Lucas didn't move. Didn't speak. Because in that moment, he didn't have to. The truth was speaking without him. Judge Marler had presided over hundreds of hearings, some loud, some chaotic, some outright tragic. But none like this. In courtroom 12B, he was no longer the center of gravity. That weight had shifted to a soldier missing a leg, a widow holding a newspaper, and a gallery full of men who hadn't asked to be remembered, only not to be erased. He cleared his throat again, voice thinner now. Mr. Trent, we are again here to determine whether your conduct on that day was unlawful under city code. You were given a lawful directive to leave. You did not comply. That, by definition, is obstruction. Lucas finally looked up. Your Honor, may I ask a question before you continue? Marler blinked. Go ahead. Lucas leaned forward. If the law says I was supposed to sit down and conscience said I had to stand up, which do you expect me to obey? The judge didn't answer. Lucas didn't flinch. I didn't shout. I didn't strike anyone. I stood up, I asked a question, and I refused to leave until they gave an answer. If that's obstruction, then I'll own it. He gestured to his prosthetic. But just so we're clear, I didn't stand on 2 feet. I stood on a promise, one this country made to every man and woman it sent into combat, the same promise this city broke the moment it chose revenue over remembrance. A hush fell over the room. Lucas continued. They gave us medals when we came home. Then they gave our housing to developers. And when we ask why, they say we're disruptive. He held up Charles Baines' letter again. This isn't disruptive. This is accountability. Then, softly. And if that makes you uncomfortable, Your Honor, maybe it should. The judge sat back, visibly shaken for the first time in the entire trial. His fingers hovered over the gavel, but he didn't strike it. Because the courtroom didn't feel like a chamber anymore. It felt like a mirror, and he didn't like what it was showing him. Just when it seemed the hearing had reached its peak, Lucas's attorney, silent until now, rose with a single manila folder in hand. Your Honor, she said carefully, With the court's permission, we'd like to enter new evidence into the record. Judge Marler rubbed his eyes. Go ahead. The bailiff took the folder, opened it, and pulled out a printed email exchange. The attorney continued, voice firm. This is a series of internal communications between the City Planning Office and Bayfront Development Group, the firm responsible for the revitalization project that displaced the veterans' housing. She paused. You'll see the language is candid. She read, We can't keep stalling. Get the remaining tenants out ASAP. Leverage code compliance if needed. One of them is a disabled vet who keeps showing up to council meetings. He's loud and too visible. Make it messy if it has to be. Just get them out before cameras show up. The room gasped. Lucas didn't blink. The judge's posture stiffened. Where did you obtain these? They were leaked anonymously to a journalist covering the case. He verified the headers. They were authenticated. Marler looked over the papers, his face clouding fast. The prosecutor spoke up. Your Honour, we had no knowledge of this. The judge cut her off. Sit down, he turned to Lucas. Did you know about this at the time of the meeting? Lucas shook his head. No, sir, but it doesn't surprise me. I felt it. I knew the moment I walked into that room they weren't looking for discussion. They were looking for surrender. Marler sat in silence for several seconds, the memo trembling slightly in his hand. Captain Clay stood again. That's what we've been trying to say, Your Honour. Lucas wasn't disorderly. He was disobedient to corruption. There's a difference. The gallery murmured with rising intensity. Even the court reporter stopped typing. Marler leaned forward, gripping the edge of the bench. This is serious. Lucas stood again, slow but steady. So was Ramadi. So was pulling Charles off his frozen porch last winter. So was watching my brothers get wheeled into shelters while luxury banners got hung across their old apartments. He took a breath. And the only thing I did wrong was assume the law was still on our side. The judge didn't respond, because there was nothing left to argue, only something left to admit. Judge Marler stared at the internal memo like it was radioactive. It hadn't just shifted the direction of the trial, it had detonated it. For the first time in his long career, the courtroom wasn't following him. It was watching him, waiting. Lucas didn't sit down. I know what you're thinking, he said, his voice calm but cutting. You're wondering if this whole thing's gotten too far out of hand, if it's become too emotional. But you know what's more emotional than this? He held up Charles Baines's letter again, reading a goodbye from a man who should still be alive. He pointed to the developer memo, knowing your city planned to throw you away on paper because you were inconvenient. He placed both on the evidence table, side by side. That's what you're really judging here. Not me, not my conduct, but your own conscience. A silence washed over the room, heavy as stone. Then slowly a new sound emerged. The gallery stood again. But this time, not just veterans, mothers, students, city workers. A man in a suit who had slipped in quietly and now stood with his hand on his heart. Even one of the courthouse janitors stopped sweeping outside the door and stepped in, eyes red. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. It was the kind of silence you couldn't buy with power. It was the kind that reclaimed the room. And still, Judge Marler said nothing, until finally he pushed back from the bench. He didn't speak to the prosecutor or to the attorney. He spoke to Lucas, and his voice, so often full of arrogance, was now low and bare. Mr. Trent, he said slowly, I want to say I was wrong, not just about the law, about you, about what this hearing meant. I mocked you for your leg. I dismissed your purpose, and I forgot that some men don't come into court looking for victory. They come looking for a voice. Lucas simply nodded, then said, some men leave pieces of themselves on foreign soil, others lose something smaller, like perspective, without ever crossing an ocean. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to, because the silence said it all. The judge had been humbled. The system had been exposed, and the one-legged soldier had just taken the entire courtroom to its knees. The judge leaned forward, elbows on the bench, his face unreadable. In front of him sat everything that had been said and shown. The broken plaque, the veteran's letter, the damning memo from the developer, and the silence of a courtroom that had become something more than judicial. Marler finally spoke. This court was convened to determine whether Staff Sergeant Lucas Trent violated municipal protocol by refusing to leave a city housing meeting, and on the basis of legal precedent, A pause. A long one. His next words didn't come from law books. They came from something else. This court finds that he did not. Gasps. The prosecutor whispered something under her breath. The court reporter's fingers hovered in mid-air. Lucas remained completely still. Judge Marler continued. But more than that, this court acknowledges a greater failure. Ours. The city's. Mine. He stood, a rare gesture for a judge, and removed his glasses. I mocked a veteran in open court. I dismissed his sacrifice as pageantry, and I ignored what the public should never forget, that men like Lucas Trent didn't just lose limbs, they lost comfort, time, peace and silence, so we could have ours. He looked at the gallery. You came here expecting a trial. You witnessed a reckoning, not of a man's actions, but of our system's soul. He turned back to Lucas. And to you, Mr. Trent, I can't return what you lost, but this courtroom owes you something. He motioned to the bailiff. Strike all charges from the record, expunge them completely, and submit this transcript to the City Ethics Board. The gavel came down, not as a punishment, but as a correction. Lucas slowly rose, not to celebrate, not to gloat, just to finish what he started. He turned to the gallery. I didn't come here to make a scene. I came here so no one like Charles Baines ever becomes a footnote again. He picked up the letter and the plaque, looked at them both, then turned to Judge Marler. Next Veterans Day, if you hand out plaques again, make sure the promises last longer than the speeches. The judge gave the faintest of nods. Outside, the hallway was packed. Reporters, veterans, strangers. Some held miniature flags, others held nothing but their breath. Because something had changed inside that courtroom, and they were waiting to carry it out. Lucas Trent stepped out of the courthouse into a crisp afternoon sun. The chill in the air didn't touch him. Not because it wasn't real, because he had already walked through worse. The crowd outside didn't cheer, they didn't chant. They just parted, like the sea, for the man who walked not with vengeance but with victory, that didn't need a soundbite. His daughter, Emily, just 12, ran up to him with a tight hug. I watched the live stream, she whispered. You didn't yell once. He smiled, ruffling her hair. Real strength doesn't have to. Behind him, veterans emerged. Captain Clay among them, now arm in arm with 2 other men who had stood beside Lucas during the darkest years of his life. Reporters tried to push in. Sergeant Trent, what would you say to the judge now? He turned toward the microphones. I already said it. I just hope he heard it. Another shouted, Do you feel like you changed anything? Lucas thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, he said, but not just the court, the mirror. Across town, someone painted a mural later that week. Lucas, mid-stance, plaque in one hand, prosthetic leg visible, an invisible army of veterans behind him. Below it, he stood, and so did we. The City Council held an emergency session. The developer project was paused indefinitely. An oversight committee was formed, named after Charles Baines, and inside a church on the edge of town, a folded flag sat on a wooden table beneath a framed letter that read, Don't punish him for standing. Thank him. Charles. Back in Lucas's small home, he placed the cracked plaque in a drawer, not out of shame, but as a reminder. His daughter placed a new one beside it, made from cardboard, scribbled in marker. It read, My dad doesn't need both legs to stand taller than the rest. That night, Lucas sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker. He didn't feel like a hero. Just a man who refused to sit down when the world expected him to. And because of that, a courtroom found its spine. A city found its conscience, and a judge, for the first time, found his knees shaking not in power, but in truth.